Good afternoon and welcome to a webinar series co-sponsored by the School of Public Affairs, Center for Environmental Policy, and Energy Innovation. This is a sectoral approach to climate mitigation, the first of 6 webinars which we will be conducting through the course of this winter and spring to analyze climate change and propose solutions at the sectoral level. That is to say, using sort of parts of the economy as our guideposts for how we need to reduce emissions, rather than the traditional approach, which is looking at emissions as sourced by nation states. As everyone knows, the nation state has had some challenges in mitigation. And so we're trying to look at other ways to think about the problem. And we're very lucky to have with us 2 speakers today from Energy Innovation and a discussant who will be joining us afterwards from the University of Strathclyde. And I will, without further ado, introduce the Senior Director of Modeling and Analysis at Energy Innovation, Robbie Orvis, who will be speaking to us in this overview session about sort of how to think about a sectoral approach. He will be joined by Rachel Goldstein, who is the Research and Modeling Manager at Energy Innovation. And then our discussant will be Patrick Bayer, and he will be joining us afterwards. We hope there is time, and we expect there will be time for questions and answers. And as time allows, please raise your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of Zoom. Okay, so thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to introduce Robbie Orvis, who joins us this morning, I guess on the West Coast. Or thank
DC,
you.
Actually.
DC.
Local here. Thanks, Todd, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm Robbie Orvis. I'm the Senior Director for Modeling and Analysis at Energy Innovation, and I'm joined by my colleague, Rachel Goldstein, as Todd mentioned, who's one of our research and modeling managers. I've been with Energy Innovation for over 8 years now, with a focus on energy modeling and policy analysis using a variety of different tools in the US and at the national and subnational level with states, and also internationally. We've done a lot of work in China and India. And I want to give Rachel a moment to introduce herself and talk a bit about her background as well.
Thanks, Robbie. Really looking forward to presenting on this with everyone here. And as Robbie mentioned, I'm the Research and Modeling Manager here at Energy Innovation. I'm a bit newer to the team than Robbie is, but I come in with some experience in the renewable energy industry, specifically spent the past few years working on solar and storage policy and market research. And now, along with Robbie, I'm focused on our modeling work here at Energy Innovation, most recently focused a bit on some state modeling work, as well as zero emissions vehicles policy research. So I'll hand it back over to Robbie, and then I'll be hopping in later to share some topics on this presentation.
Thanks, Rachel. So Energy Innovation quickly is a climate and energy policy think tank. We work directly with policymakers all around the world to provide analysis and insights on how to design clean energy and climate policy, and which policies can drive the largest emissions reductions and generate the largest benefits for the economy, for jobs, and for public health. So we're really excited to be here today to talk a bit about sectoral breakdown of global greenhouse gas emissions and emissions policy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen, and we'll jump right in. Okay, so today we're gonna cover a few different topics. We're gonna start with talking about why a sectoral approach matters to thinking about emissions and policy, what the sources of greenhouse gas emissions are when we look at a sectoral approach. Then we're going to dive into each of the kind of main energy sectors, and also we're going to talk a bit about some of the non-energy sectors. And then to wrap up, we're going to talk about what it all means for policy. And I just want to mention that today we're going to go through each of these pretty quickly. And in the subsequent webinars, other experts from our organizations are going to be doing a deep dive into each one of these sectors to give even more detail and talk about the different policy options. So if you find today's presentation interesting, be sure to join those as well, because they'll go into a lot more detail. So stepping back and just thinking about a sectoral approach to greenhouse gas mitigation, why is it important to approach this by looking at sectors? So there's a few reasons here. So first is that emissions are generated by physical things in the economy. So you think of things like cars or furnaces or boilers, and those things within the economy tend to be different in different sectors. For example, in transportation, we have a lot of things related to vehicles. In an electricity sector, we have power plants. And so it's useful to organize the types of physical things in the economy that produce emissions into the different sectors that they're based in, because then you can start thinking about substitutes and ways in which the different pieces of equipment are similar or dissimilar. That lets you kind of compare within a sector. It makes the problem more tractable. And within a given sector, there can be common clean energy technologies that might address common needs. And so that allows you to kind of focus on the technologies that can solve a variety of emissions problems within a single sector. Some sectors may also have special considerations. So as you'll see today, we've broadly organized the energy emissions into 4 sectors, which are electricity, transportation, industry, and buildings. There is, of course, more detail once you drill down into each of those sectors. But sometimes that detail and difference within a sector, it still can be helpful to think about it within the broader sector that it sits in. So for example, the industry sector, the manufacturing sector, that includes a lot of different types of industries. You can think of cement, iron and steel, food processing, and others, which while broadly are part of the industry sector, are also very different. However, as we'll see, there are commonalities even within a single sector like the industry sector. For example, the need for process heat. And we can draw some insights about those commonalities and what it means for clean energy technologies and policy. And then finally here, with a few exceptions, carbon pricing maybe being the most obvious one, at least national or subnational policy typically targets things within a single sector. So you'll see things like incentives for electric vehicles or for clean electricity, or you'll see standards for electric vehicles or clean electricity. And so policy typically tends to be focused within a single sector, again, with the large caveat being carbon pricing, although we've seen various approaches to carbon pricing around the world and various levels of success, which we'll touch on at the very end of today. So when we're thinking about how to approach emissions mitigation by sector, we kind of follow the structure here. We start by identifying which sectors matter. And as we'll see, that can vary a lot from one country to another based on the makeup of the economy, the economic specialization, population, geography, and so on. Within the key sectors, we then want to move on to identifying the sources of emissions within each sector. So what are the major sources in the electricity sector or in the transportation sector? And that can help us identify which clean technology options can be deployed in that sector to cut emissions. Of course, a lot of models can tell us the clean technology mix, but what they often don't tell us is the policies that can be used to lead to that level of deployment. So once we've identified the major sources of emissions and the technology options to cut those emissions, we then have to survey what policies can increase deployment of clean energy technologies to those levels, accounting for political viability and other political economic considerations. And just as an anecdote, one thing almost everyone always mentions to us when we do any kind of policy analysis is, well, did you consider this? This is often carbon pricing. And oftentimes the answer is yes, but given the political context in the region we're looking in, it may be that that particular policy is not viable. So it's really important to have this lens of political viability and political economic considerations when you're looking at which policies can deploy those clean technology options. So where do emissions come from globally? There are four main greenhouse gases. These are often referred to as the Kyoto gases because they were identified as part of the Kyoto Protocol. And that includes carbon dioxide or CO2, methane or CH4, N2O or nitrous oxide, and a broad suite of pollutants called F gases. These are made up of a variety of things like HFCs, sulfur hexafluoride, and other gases that have a very high global warming potential, which means that per unit of emissions, for example, gram or ton, they have thousands of times more warming than CO2. So even though here on a greenhouse gas equivalent basis, which is what we're looking at here, they look significant. If you look at the total tons of emissions, they're much smaller. So these are small amounts of emissions of very potent greenhouse gases. And a couple of notes here. This is looking at billion metric tons of gases using 100-year timeline. So sometimes when we're looking at the emissions of pollutants, we'll consider different timelines. And for the non-CO2 gases, that's really important because the timeline helps tell us how potent a greenhouse gas is. For methane, for example, if we look at it over 100 years, it's about 28 times as strong as CO2 per ton emitted. But if we look at it on a 20-year timeline, it's about 80 times as strong. And that's because over time, methane or CH4 breaks down into CO2. So the longer the time horizon, the closer it approximates the warming impact of CO2. But in the near term, it has a more significant effect on warming per ton emitted. So it's important to consider the timelines when you're looking at the contribution of various gases to global warming. And then one other comment is just those values, the global warming potential values, have changed over time as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which produces reports every few years on the advance of climate change. As they review the science, they update the values for these different pollutants. So here we've tried to stick to using what are called AR5, which are values from the 5th assessment report over 100 years. All right, so we find this to be a really helpful figure here. So this is a graph of emissions by country and sector, and everything is proportional to global emissions. This includes the top 20 countries globally that are responsible for emissions and the 6 major sectors of the economy. And this excludes what's called LULUCF, that's land use change, and forestry, which we'll come back to later. And so what you can see, for example, is that the industrial sector and the electricity sector in China, those two sectors in China alone are responsible for a very large proportion of global greenhouse gas emissions. The top 3 countries, China, the US, and India, are together responsible for about 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the top 20 countries, which is everything here except for ROW, which stands for rest of world, are responsible for more than 3/4 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So if we're able to target the top sectors in the top 20 countries, we can make a huge impact on emissions. And we think this is really helpful because it helps make this problem really tractable. You know, if we look at industry and electricity in China, those are the big ones. Transportation and electricity industry in the US are the big ones. You can see that in India, agriculture is a much more significant contributor than it is in other countries. So this really helps us target the different sectors of different countries where emissions are largest. You can see here that total emissions for 2021 were just shy of 60 gigatons. That's 60 billion tons of CO2 equivalent. That accounts for all the different greenhouse gases. And then there's also a category here, which is international aviation and marine, and that was about 1 gigaton. Those tend to be tracked separately because once airplanes and ships move into international waters or international air, there's not a great accounting system for assigning those emissions to a particular country. So you'll see in most international reporting and elsewhere, they tend to be tracked separately. So to summarize, to address global greenhouse gas emissions, the effort should really be placed on the top 20 countries if we're just thinking about maximizing where we spend our time. We need to address emissions from each of the sectors. One thing you saw from that graphic is that each region has significant emissions from all the different sectors of the economy. but we can target our work in different sectors based on how large they are in a given country. That typically is electricity and industry. Those are usually the largest, but transportation can be significant. And depending on the country, the building sector can also be significant. The other thing that's not really captured well by the previous graph is that the buildings sector especially has large indirect emissions. Indirect emissions means that, for example, the electricity generation to supply buildings with electricity is actually a significant source of emissions. And those are housed within the electricity sector when we look at the type of graphic we looked at, but a very significant share of electricity demand comes from buildings. And that's an important consideration as well. There's also this question of how to address international emissions, like those international aviation and shipping emissions. Those can be really significant. And one thing we see is, as we look at implementing policy to decarbonize countries, is that those emissions tend to remain, in part because they're international, in part because they tend to be some of the hardest emissions to abate. So that leads us to identify the sources of sectoral emissions within each sector and the different types of clean options, clean technology or other policy options to address those emissions. So we're going to spend the rest of the time today digging a bit into each of these sectors to better understand what the sources of emissions are and how they vary across different countries. And then some important considerations as we think about the different clean technology options, and then what that kind of leaves as considerations for clean options. And at the end, we're going to think about how it all ties back to policy. So for now, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to take us down a bit of detail on the electricity sector and transportation, and then I'll be back to do industry, buildings, and land, and then to wrap us up at the end. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Robbie. So as Robbie mentioned, we'll switch over to talking about each sector individually. So first, we'll cover the electricity sector. This sector makes up a large chunk of many countries' total greenhouse gas emissions, as we saw on that slide a couple slides ago. However, it is unique in that there's existing deployable zero carbon technology like wind and solar that can power this sector. Electricity is also an increasingly important sector to be focusing on for a transition to a clean energy economy, as other greenhouse gas emitting sectors like transportation or buildings seek to electrify more in order to meet their clean energy goals. Next slide. So though the electricity sector has clear decarbonization pathways, electricity generation is still globally primarily generated by coal and gas. Coal has twice the emissions intensity of gas, and over the past decade, we've seen a bit of a transition, at least in the United States, to have gas make up a larger proportion of electricity generation. And we can attribute some greenhouse gas emissions declines to that. However, gas is still not a zero carbon resource. Clean energy is growing quickly, but it has a long way to go in order to fully displace carbon intensive sources of electricity generation. And on these charts, you can see down at the bottom on the electricity generation by source, it's just wind and solar are just those bottom two lines there, the light blue and the purple. And then above it, you'll see nuclear and hydro, which are also zero carbon sources. Next slide. And it's important to note that electricity generation does vary significantly country to country. This is due to everything from resource availability and geography to policy and regulation. In the US, you can see that in the mid-2010s, and that's the chart on the upper left there, in case that's hard to see. You can see that in the mid-2010s, we started to see a significant shift from coal to gas. Meanwhile, coal is still the predominant source of electricity generation in India and China, and has still been growing over the past decade. Canada benefits greatly from its natural hydropower resources that are not available in other countries. And in Japan, we can see the significant effects of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in 2011, which shows how much that event altered their energy makeup. And that's the bottom right. You'll see that big dip in nuclear and mostly was displaced with natural gas. Next slide. So technology costs vary considerably in different regions, which informs the makeup of the electricity supply that we covered on the last slide. Like I mentioned, resource availability, geography, and policy impact those technology costs. And we can also consider how global trade and supply chain constraints can also impact costs of technology in different countries. So yeah, move on to the next slide. So as we transition to a cleaner electricity sector with more wind and solar, it's important to understand that the outputs of different kinds of technologies can vary by season or by day. So some clean energy technologies like wind and solar are not as flexible on their own and are sometimes called intermittent. I prefer the term variable. So sometimes the issue isn't simply building more of a generation source, but rather figuring out how to manage the load to get it where it needs to go at the time that it's needed. And there are a handful of ways to do that. Next slide, please. So to illustrate this, I'm going to give a very brief explanation of the so-called duck curve in solar and how that impacts ramping requirements for other sources of generation. If you look at the lines on the upper part of the chart, the gray line kind of looks like the top of a duck, and that's how it got its name. And there's a big effort now in the solar industry to flatten the duck curve, to make that gray line much smoother and make sure that we can meet demand at the time that it's needed. So solar generates most of its output during the midday, and that output slows down in the evening hours, of course, when the sun is going down. However, that is often the time when people are coming home, turning on their lights and using their appliances. So solar output wanes just as consumer demand starts to go up in the evening. And because solar energy has displaced as high a need for other sources of electricity generation, say from a natural gas plant, those sources need to work extra hard in the evening hours to ramp back up to meet consumer demand. And this can be a pretty inefficient process, even from an emissions perspective. Now, saying all of this should not dissuade us from wanting to build out more solar, but rather show us that we need to acknowledge that the solutions are more complicated than simply build more stuff. I also want to note that there are only very few places in the country and even the world where this is currently a problem, namely places with a lot of solar power and only seasonally. So for example, California in the spring and the fall. Because there simply isn't this much solar capacity in most places. So if there's not a ton of solar capacity, you're not really going to be seeing these issues yet. That said, in a future world where we do have more build out of renewable energy, these are things we want to start addressing now so that we can actually see that high penetration of solar and wind on the grid. Last thing I want to note is that there are solutions to flatten the duck curve. Battery technology can help shift the load, and more robust transmission lines can spread out energy supplied by solar during peak output hours. So just a little explanation of how solar and wind kind of don't function in the same exact way as what we consider these kind of incumbent and flexible sources of generation that we're used to. Next slide, please. So moving on to how we can decarbonize the electricity sector, this sector probably has the clearest pathway for decarbonization, like I mentioned, thanks to existing deployable zero carbon, zero emissions technologies like wind, solar, hydro, nuclear, and more. But there are other things that we should be considering. Existing fossil fuel technology could be retrofitted as technology advances, and we can also ensure a heavier focus on demand side resources like battery storage. Building out grid infrastructure for more robust transmission and distribution lines will enable higher penetration of renewable energy on the grid while also ensuring reliability. Next slide. So now we'll move on to the transportation sector. The transportation sector makes up nearly a third of emissions in the US and is a large portion of emissions in most other countries and regions as well. Vehicles have historically been powered by internal combustion engines that utilize petroleum, sometimes a small amount of biofuels. And these gas-powered vehicles not only create greenhouse gas emissions, but also lead to localized air pollution that causes environmental and public health concerns. So there are several reasons to move away from gas-powered internal combustion engine vehicles and to something cleaner. So there's now a push for the transportation sector auto industries to switch over to electric vehicles, which don't emit pollution on site and are powered by the grid, by the electricity grid. And because the grid has those clear decarbonization pathways that we just discussed in the previous section, this is a key way that we can reduce emissions from the transportation sector. And towards the end of this section, I'll also mention a few other ways that this sector can bring down emissions. But for now, we'll move on to the next slide. So overall, global transportation emissions primarily come from cars and trucks due to the sheer number of these vehicles on the road. Shipping, aviation, and rail emissions are also quite significant, but they face kind of different and unique challenges to decarbonization. It's not as simple as creating a plug-in airplane, so a little bit trickier there. So for the purposes of this section, we're mainly going to be focused on-road vehicles, or the items here in blue. Next section. So like the electricity sector, transportation emissions by source vary significantly by country. And this is due to many factors such as geography, policy and regulation, cultural norms, availability of public transportation in cities, vehicle costs, and more. Next slide. And these factors also impact the types of vehicles that consumers purchase. So in the following few slides, I think it's helpful to focus on the little green dot, which might be a little hard to see, but hopefully you can see that all right. The little green dot and the y-axis on the right-hand side, that indicates the share of electric vehicle sales by country. So on this first slide, we can see that China and Europe have made some significant progress over the past few years in seeing how much their car sales, electric vehicle car sales, have increased in the past 5 or so years. And meanwhile, the US looks like it probably still has some work to do. On the next slide, we can see that Germany's sales are now over 25% electric vehicles. Couple other pretty successful countries, as well as other countries that are also maybe lagging a bit behind in terms of how much EV growth how much growth we've seen in the EV market. Next slide, please. And this slide here, we'll see some of the countries with the highest EV sales shares. We've got Sweden, Norway, and the Netherlands. As you can see, Norway actually has about 90% of its sales coming from electric vehicle sales. All right, and next slide. So part of the reason we see such variation in the share of electric vehicle car sales country to country is that ownership costs can vary quite a bit by country and by years of ownership. So for most cases, electric vehicles are cheaper to own over the course of their lifetime, not necessarily capital cost wise, but just overall from purchasing the vehicle to the end of its life, because you're obviously not buying gasoline. But that said, a lot of people don't buy electric vehicles. Upfront costs, unfamiliarity with the technology, or concerns about range or charging infrastructure can dissuade sales. And then, of course, if certain countries don't have policy or infrastructure in place to make it attractive to buy an electric vehicle, you're going to see less sales there as well. So here's where policy can be really helpful in encouraging people to choose to purchase electric vehicles. And we've, of course, seen some of that with the Inflation Reduction Act here in the United States, as well as certain state policies, and other countries have other ways of incentivizing purchasing electric vehicles rather than internal combustion engine. Next slide. So when discussing decarbonization of the transportation sector, we need to recognize that there are some significant timelines for stock turnover. So in this sector, even if a country has committed to selling 100% EVs in a certain year, there's still going to be a delay in the stock turnover. People will hold on to their vehicles for several years, even decades after purchasing and before purchasing a new car. So there's going to be that considerable lag in vehicle stock turnover following electric vehicle policies. Next slide. So decarbonizing the transportation sector requires some comprehensive changes. Rather than retrofitting, as can be done in some sectors, this sector really requires stock turnover and replacement with zero emissions vehicles. And the vast majority of zero emissions vehicles are likely to be battery electric or plug-in hybrids, though we might see some new advanced technologies take off in the future. There was a time that people were really gunning for fuel cell vehicles, and we'll see if those start to make a comeback. But for now, we're really seeing the most growth with battery-powered electric vehicles. Other efforts to decarbonize the sector, which we did not include as much here, but again, future presentations will go more into detail on each of these sectors, involve simply reducing car travel. Investment in public transit and bike infrastructure in cities can significantly change the way that we move around. And new social norms like teleworking can also reduce how much car travel we see. And from a deployment perspective, we are further away from low carbon alternatives to air travel and shipping, but these hard to decarbonize areas will also require quite a bit of attention in the coming years. And I'll pass it back to Robbie to cover the next sector.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. So moving along to the industry sector, we'll start by taking a look at where global industry emissions come from. This is a look at the top sources of emissions from different industries, and then the different types of emissions. So energy versus process, and then CO2 versus non-CO2 gases. So just to dive into this for a minute, there's different types of emissions, and it's important to talk a bit about each of those in the industrial sector. So one is energy. You can just think of that as being fossil fuels that are combusted to produce heat or electricity. So a lot of industrial processes require a range of different temperature heat. And so that's that energy CO2. So the really big ones there are chemicals, non-metallic minerals, that's predominantly cement manufacturing, iron and steel, and then refining and gas. And then you start to see it drops off pretty considerably. Process emissions and process CO2 is in yellow. So sometimes when we're manufacturing goods, there's actually chemical processes that produce CO2 as a byproduct of the chemical process, and it has nothing to do with the combustion of fossil fuels. And so in cement manufacturing, for example, in the process of creating clinker for cement, there's a chemical reaction that breaks down the input, and one of the byproducts is CO2. So you can see that for that non-metallic minerals bar, the yellow process CO2 part of the bar is very large, and that's because there's a chemical process. It's important to distinguish between these because replacing energy CO2 is very different than replacing process CO2. And we'll come back to that. But in some instances, you can pretty easily replace energy, fossil fuel energy that's used for heat with other sources like electricity. But if it's a process-related CO2 emission, that means you either have to capture it or you have to come up with a different process to eliminate that CO2. And then there's a couple of other important gases here. So especially for mining, you see that the CH4 or methane bar is really large. And that's because whether this is predominantly from mining for energy, so coal, natural gas, and oil, there's a lot of methane that's released in that process. So coal mines release methane just to the atmosphere when they're opened because there's trapped methane in the mine. And then when we drill and extract oil and gas, there's a fair amount of methane that escapes during that process, and then methane that can escape from the transmission and distribution pipelines as well as during gas processing. And so even though mining has pretty low energy CO2, and some process CO2, the overwhelming source of emissions from mining and energy extraction is from the release of methane. N2O is also a gas. Globally, it's predominantly in agriculture, but there is some emissions of N2O from the chemicals industry. And then finally, F gases here are in green. And it's a bit odd that they're all assigned to chemicals, but that is globally how we tend to track F gas emissions. The majority of F-gas emissions are from refrigerants that we use in things like air conditioning units, whether they're in buildings or in cars, or we use in refrigerators. F-gases are also used in foams and as solvents. But the way that they're tracked globally is they're kind of allocated to the chemical sector. But the actual point of emissions is often in buildings or in vehicles, where these gases tend to leak out over time from those systems. And we'll come back to this in a bit, but there was a global treaty signed several years ago, the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, that significantly cuts into F-gas emissions and is a significant achievement for global emissions. So there's also indirect emissions. So here, this chart shows direct energy related emissions. That's from on-site combustion of fossil fuels for energy or heat. There's the yellow for CO2 process emissions. And then in purple are indirect energy related emissions. And indirect emissions are just, they're emissions like to produce electricity. So the electricity is delivered on site to the manufacturing plant, but the emissions are upstream. And so industry and buildings in particular have considerable indirect emissions. And then as Rachel just mentioned, over time, as we electrify transportation, the emissions will shift to becoming more indirect as well. So as with global emissions, industrial production is also highly concentrated. So for 3 of the largest sources of emissions and production, steel, chemicals, and cement, you can see that global production of these commodities is highly concentrated first in China, but then in Europe, chemicals and steel in Europe, and the rest of Asia and the US. And so this should also serve as somewhat of a guidepost to where it's most important to implement clean industrial policy, obviously starting with China, but also then in Europe. Those two tend to be the 2 largest sources. And as with other sectors, we can see there's a huge difference in industrial emissions across countries. So on the left here, we have, and I know there's a lot of industries and they're kind of small, but on the left, you have the US and on the right, you have China. And you can see on the for the US, that's the major sources of industrial emissions are oil and gas extraction, like methane, chemicals, refining in black, and then iron and steel and cement are significant, but they're not as big considering the rest of the emissions profile. Whereas in China, chemicals, iron and steel and cement are totally dominant relative to the other sources of emissions. So even in countries with that are large manufacturing centers, the emissions composition can vary considerably. And part of the reason that you don't see a big red wedge in China is actually China has pretty small amounts of oil and gas resources, and so there's not a ton of extraction there or natural gas consumption, and as a result, you don't really have methane leakage from the energy system, with the exception being from coal mine methane as large a source of emissions. And actually, you can see the gray coal mining wedge on the bottom of the China chart is much bigger than it is for the US. So another thing to note here is just that industrial heat temperature needs vary widely. So really quickly, what this is showing is that the temperature of heat needed for different industries varies considerably. So iron and steel needs a lot of very high temperature heat, but a lot of industries need pretty low temperature heat. And that has implications for how we can decarbonize those industries. So for example, this chart shows the amount of electrification by industry, meaning the amount of energy use that can be switched to electricity to decarbonize those different industries. And the takeaway here is that, at least for Europe, about 3/4 of the total energy demand in industry could be switched to electricity with commercially available technologies. So I'm sure that many of you have heard about hydrogen being discussed, especially for industry, but it's important to acknowledge that there are other options as well, some of which are already commercially available, like industrial heat pumps that can be used to decarbonize a significant amount of industry. So in terms of options to decarbonize the industry sector, kind of just summing this up, that leaves us with first replacing low and medium temperature process heat. That's that energy CO2 producing technologies with zero carbon technologies. These can be things like industrial heat pumps, microwave heating, electric resistance heaters, and so on. For the medium and high temperature processes where electrification might not be an option, then we need to start thinking about zero carbon fuels, whether that's green or blue hydrogen, renewable natural gas, or biofuels. For some emission sources, particularly where they're processed CO2, then we need to start thinking about different processes to produce those commodities. So for iron and steel, for example, a very common emission-intensive process is a blast furnace coupled with a blast oxygen furnace. That's BF. But increasingly, we're seeing electric arc furnace DRI steel, and that uses recycled steel, and then it uses an electric furnace instead of a coal or gas furnace to produce steel, and it can really cut down on CO2 emissions. And then electrowinning is a type of chemical process that's being explored in refining and petrochemicals, where you can actually use electricity to help break apart the molecules instead of doing it with heat that's produced from fossil fuels. And for some areas, it will be hard to come up with those alternatives, like for cement, for example. And there we're going to need to capture and store or utilize process and remaining energy CO2. And then as we continue to use natural gas, capturing and utilizing that gas instead of letting it leak through the system and flaring it where we can't use it, really cuts down on emissions. So moving on to the building sector, I'm going to go a little faster here. Global buildings emissions are predominantly from space heating, water heating, and cooking. And that's because that's really where we're using the different types of fuels. There's still a lot of biomass used globally for building heating and for cooking, but the remaining emissions are predominantly from natural gas and like petroleum, like liquid LPG or liquefied petroleum gas. As I mentioned with some other sectors, buildings actually have a large amount of indirect emissions. So this figure shows US building sector emissions, and you can see that 2/3 of the total emissions generated by buildings are actually upstream. They're indirect in the production of electricity. And only about 1/3 of the emissions are actually on site at the building. So as we think about decarbonizing buildings, it's important to think about both on site but also upstream emissions reductions and electrification. Just a quick note, we talked a bit about F-gases and HFCs. HFCs were on pace to really dramatically increase and to drive significant warming through 2050. But the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol made a huge dent in emissions of these pollutants. So this figure on the right was from prior to Kigali, and it showed annual emissions of about 3.6 billion metric tons of CO2e. And with the Kigali Amendment, that's now estimated to be down to 1 or less than 1. So we've cut emissions of these pollutants, assuming implementation of Kigali, by almost 2/3, which is really a significant achievement. So building emissions also vary widely across countries. That can be different fuels used. So for example, in China and Europe, there's a lot of use of district heat. So that'll be a central heating plant produces high temperature steam, which is then piped into buildings. But we don't really use any of that in the US for the most part, except for some university campuses, and district cooling as well. And then we have abundant natural gas in the US. So that's a primary source of building energy. But in other countries where natural gas is much more expensive, that may not be the case. So you can have a big variation because of fuel availability. Also energy service needs. So for example, in Southeast Asia, there's not much demand for building heating. So most building emissions are from cooking and then indirect emissions from cooling. And then the availability and affordability of energy services. So a lot of parts of the world don't have access to energy services like cooling. And that means that current building emissions might be much smaller than if that need were actually met. Density and building floor area per capita is another one. The more dense an area is, I have this backwards here, but the more dense an area is means it's less energy per capita. So more dense cities tend to have lower building energy use per person. And then the quality of construction materials matters as well. So some parts of the world buildings only last 20 years or so. In the US, a typical building might last 80 years or longer. That can lead to what's called large embodied emissions if buildings have to be replaced with new cement or concrete-based buildings every few years. And the higher the quality of the building and the better the envelope, the lower the demand for things like heating and cooling. So when we think about options to decarbonize the building sector, we need to replace fossil fuel burning equipment with electrified alternatives. That could be things like heat pumps or resistance heating, induction stoves, heat pump water heaters, and others. Improved efficiency of equipment is really important too, to minimize those indirect emissions. So LEDs for lighting are over 90% more efficient today than incandescent lights just a decade ago. So that's another example of really kind of a breakthrough technology. Heat pumps again, and then other types of appliances that can be made much more efficient. Improving building design and insulation. The more we can better insulate and improve the thermal envelope in building, the more will decrease the demand for energy services in the building. And then finally, encouraging density. So the denser we can make areas, the lower the energy demand per unit floor area. There's a whole bunch of other benefits that come with density as well. So lastly here, and not going to spend too much time on this, and it's a little outside of the scope of what we focus on, but the agriculture and land sectors are important global sources of emissions. So looking at global agriculture emissions, these are predominantly from a mix of crops and soils, livestock, and land use change. And the top 5 countries here are responsible for about 30% of global emissions. So emissions do tend to be concentrated, although not to the degree they are for global greenhouse gas emissions. And even within a country, they can be from a variety of different sources. Land use change in forestry, or LULUCF, as it's sometimes called. There's a little bit of overlap here with the agriculture part, but these are predominantly emissions from deforestation. And emissions vary widely. So on the left-hand side, you see some of the largest emitting countries in terms of land use emissions, and this is from broad-scale deforestation of those areas. So Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Brazil, and so on. And then on the right-hand side, you actually see there's some countries, including the US, that actually have what's called a net land use sink, which means our land use sector is actually absorbing emissions every year. And in the US, at least if you look at the official inventory, we get about 800 million metric tons of uptake of CO2 every year from our land use sector. The other thing that's important is land use emissions are notoriously difficult to track, both in terms of just understanding what the emissions are, but also in terms of understanding the mitigation of emissions. As an example, I looked at several data sets to pull this together, and the common number here for the US was around 200 million metric tons of net land use sink every year. But if we look at the official inventory and the data the US submits to the IPCC, it's around 800 million metric tons. So there's widely different reporting, and it's notoriously challenging to track these emissions properly. And the policy mechanism is also quite different. So RED Plus is a global policy mechanism and reporting mechanism for tracking land use and forestry related emissions. So we've gone through each of the major sectors, but where does that leave us in terms of the role for policy? In the background here, this is the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act in the House in the US from a couple of months ago, which was a historic moment here. So the goal for climate policy is to increase the adoption of the clean energy technologies and eliminate other emissions like those methane emissions that we've just gone over. And there's lots of different types of policies, but they can broadly be grouped a few different ways. So one is economic signals. So we can think of things like penalties or taxes that make polluting or dirty equipment more expensive, or incentives or subsidies that make it more economic to adopt clean energy technology. There's also standards and regulations, like requirements to adopt certain types of equipment, meet certain product requirements, install certain types of controls, and so on. And there's also research and development. So public and private sector research that unlocks new technologies and drives down the cost or improves the efficiency of new technologies. These actually work best when they're all used together. And that's because support for research and and help bring down their cost further and make them more economic. And then performance standards can require those new technologies to be used. And then when these all work together, they work together to make for a very low cost clean energy ecosystem. So that brings us to the end of the presentation today, but looking forward, policies to increase clean technology adoption vary by sector. Market failures mean that some types of policies are more effective in certain sectors than others, and there'll be a lot more information about that in the forthcoming webinars. And the policies for a given sector depend on the existing technologies in that sector, differences across regions, and costs or savings. So in subsequent series, there will be a deep dive into each of these sectors, more information on the technologies and the top policies that account for each of those differences. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back over to you, Todd.
Thank you so much. It was really a pleasure to hear your presentation, which really helped place a lot of disparate trends in economics and technology into a broad overview. So really, thank you. Your presentations have really set a great tenor for the rest of the series, which, by the way, continues on March 7th at 1 p.m. So I just want to thank you for that, and also convey that we're running just a little bit over time. We're going to try and run maybe 5 minutes late to get to some questions. But first, let's turn please to Patrick Bayer, who is a reader in the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Strathclyde, if I'm pronouncing the university correctly, but I am better at pronouncing University of Glasgow, where you'll be a professor after this spring. So thank you very much for joining us in the evening in Glasgow, and please give us your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Todd, and very well done on Strathclyde. This is indeed one of the trickier names on this side of the Atlantic. So yeah, welcome everyone. Thank you so much, Rachel and Robbie, for a great presentation, and Todd for having me. It's been a great pleasure. As Todd has already been saying, I'm an academic, I'm a trained political scientist, and I study primarily political economy of environmental regulation. So kind of the comments or the ideas or the reflections I'd want to present will tap on some of those issues. I'll try to be brief, really, in the interest of allowing a discussion, and I see that there's many questions coming in already. But essentially, I just really wanted to convey 2 points, I think. The first point I wanted to make is the idea of, well, why is it actually good news to focus on sectors rather than on the nation state? And I think Todd alluded to some of that in his introductory remarks. So that's the one message I want to comment on. And then the second message is, well, what are potential dangers by focusing on sectors, right? And then hopefully that again sets the stage for future iterations of this webinar. So on my first point, really, I guess the focus on sectors is a very welcome development, I think, in international climate governance. And I guess the reason for some of that has been that, well, we've seen the focus on the nation state hasn't worked too well, right? So kind of we all know the pictures of ending international climate negotiations and despair and gridlocked situations. And I think what the literature or what we know from research about this is really that, well, ultimately this is due to kind of 2 things. And one thing being that, well, if a lot of countries with a lot of different interests need to negotiate and need to find common ground, then this is very difficult, just because the kind of the difference in the interests that those countries want from the global south, from the global north, different economic development level, different domestic institutions. That makes those negotiations very difficult, and that paired with this UN framework notion that we need to find consensus, or you need to find unanimous decision making is very difficult, right? And so there is then research that actually says, well, if we want to get around these obstacles, one way to go is kind of what was known as climate clubs, right? So the idea here is really straightforward and simple, namely, well, focus on those countries who actually want to push climate policy forward, right? And I think in spirit, this is very similar to this notion of sectoral approaches, right? Because sectors have kind of share some of the interests, at least more so than if we compare countries, right? So let's say, I don't know, the transport sector in the US and the transport sector in Europe and let's say Africa, right? They may have more similarities than if we look at those countries as a whole. And then so I think this is why this push to look at sectors is very welcome from the structural point of view. I think it's also very welcome just from a regulatory standpoint, right? I guess again, from a political science standpoint, the one worry with policymakers or regulators is, well, by pushing climate policies very aggressively, we might actually undermine the industrial competitiveness of our industries, of our companies and businesses. And one potential way around this here could be that, again, because sectors amongst themselves are similar, that kind of if we focus regulation on particular sectors, then that might, again, this might allow a way forward, right? So I think both from a regulatory standpoint, but also from a structural standpoint, focusing on sectors does make a lot of sense. And we see that, again, international climate community and policymakers have caught on to this idea. And I think we've seen that very forcefully at the end of the COP26 negotiations here in Glasgow, where we have seen a lot of a huge flurry of sectoral initiatives, right? And again, I think Robbie and Rachel talked a lot about the different sectors, and basically every sector has seen some sectoral commitments, right? They range from finance, from green shipping, from international aviation, from deforestation, methane pledges. So I think, again, the idea was, in this situation in which we face this climate emergency, but on the other hand, face gridlock at the international level where countries negotiate, one way forward might be to kind of identify sectors and to identify those sectors, as Robbie has been saying, in especially those countries where the benefits or the returns for driving down carbon emissions are the highest, right? And so I think there's a lot of justification for why we want to focus on sectors. The second point that I alluded to and that I would want to end on is really this notion of, well, kind of what are potential dangers by focusing on sectors, right? And so here I think the one caveat or the one point that I want us to think about is that, obviously, yes, it is true that sectors share more interests, say, if we compare sectors to countries, relatively speaking. But then even within those different sectors, we need to recognize that there will be different types of firms which potentially have different interests, right? And that can be down to different positions in kind of the market structures. It can be down to different use of technologies. It can be down to different firm size, or whether a firm is an MNC or owned privately, publicly, right? So I think what we should be mindful of, to, again, speaking to the point that Robbie mentioned, that if we want to drive down carbon emissions in those sectors, these kind of transition paths need to be underpinned with particular policies. We need to be mindful that we don't kind of treat sectors as kind of homogeneous units, but do understand the different interests within those sectors. And that, again, might bring challenges or might bring additional opportunities. And potentially, again, I think these could be some aspects that some of the future webinars might be touching on. But kind of the point that I really want to make here is that we need to recognize there is variation in the interest within those sectors, and we need to understand what that means for policy making and kind of the design of the policies that should underpin the drive down of carbon emissions in those particular sectors. And I'll stop at that point, Todd, if that's all right. And that should leave us with another 15 minutes or so for questions from the audience.
Thank you so much. That was also some very helpful comments about sort of pathways forward and considering what hasn't worked in the past and how to rethink this whole question of mitigation and how to redefine how we conceive of where to make the cuts. And I think what we've shown and will continue to demonstrate is that some of these decisions have some political aspects to them. And we do have a large number of questions from the audience. So I want to thank Robbie, Rachel, and Patrick. And just I think I'm going to take the moderator prerogative and ask a question to start with. And I think I'm going to favor quickly the broad questions, because I think some of the sectoral questions, if we don't get to them this time, can be answered in some of the more specific sectoral discussions coming up. But I think broadly, I guess I'm going to ask first, well, I'm going to ask a question and make a quick comment, which is just to address a question about where you got your data, and to thank you for such precise sourcing on your slides, but also to congratulate you for a book that you guys published at Energy Innovation a few years ago, and the updates, I understand, to your energy policy simulator, which I guess I would wonder if you could speak to ever so briefly. In other words, it seems to me that you model your own data in part. And so what you presented here was a combination of, sources, outside sources, but also sort of in-house conclusions drawn from modeling. And I guess the question I would ask as part of that is a question about how it is that you model the role of policy in obtaining, mitigation outcomes. That is, you mentioned the importance of policy. Can you model when policy is implemented and how efficient it is, and what kind of assumptions do you make about the role of policy, which implies what role do governments have at the end of the day, and how do you account for that in the models? So I guess I would turn that over to whoever would answer that. I guess our energy innovation speakers, and then I'll collect some other questions from this growing list.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Good question. So yes, definitely wanted to be sure that everything was sourced and also serve as a resource for others. It can be very hard to find all that data. So the data in the most of the data in the presentation is from a mix of, for example, the International Energy Agency and other international groups that have public resources. They also have some proprietary resources you can pay for. But Todd, as you mentioned, so one of the things we spend a lot of time on at Energy Innovation is the development and maintenance of this tool called the Energy Policy Simulator. It is an open source, publicly available model for dozens of different regions. We actually just released versions for the 48 contiguous US states a couple weeks ago that anyone can access if you go to https://energypolicy.solutions. All of the models are available there. They run in a web browser, or you can download them and run them for free on your computer using some free software called Vensim Model Reader. And the idea of those tools is to provide policymakers, think tanks, students, practitioners, and others with a resource to try and understand the potential impact of policies on emissions, health, and jobs. And to do it in a way that's completely transparent and open source. And if you have your own data, you don't want to use the National Renewable Energy Lab's data or whatever, you can put your own data in and run it. And it's documented online there. And so Todd, to your question, a lot of models, what they do is they tell you the technology deployment that you need to get to hit, like, say, a carbon budget or a warming budget. But what they don't necessarily tell you, aside from just saying, here's the carbon price that gets you this in this model, is actually what policies can get you there. And so what we've tried to do with the Energy Policy Simulator is to kind of flip that on its head. So when you change things in the model, you're not changing deployment levels per se, you're actually changing policies like a policymaker would. I want to put on a carbon price, I want to put on a clean electricity standard, I want to give an incentive for electric vehicle adoption, and then you're seeing in the model what the outcome is. So the whole reason we created the tool is to put the user in the role of policymaker, not in the role of what was once referred to me as energy technology god, where you specify what will become, but instead, how do we actually get to those things? And so the model is really focused on what the different policies do and to making sure we correctly account for the ways that policies interact with one another and the way that the whole system, if you have a zero emissions vehicle policy, the model also accounts for the upstream changes in electricity emissions that result from that. So yeah, definitely encourage folks to check that out if you're interested, and let us know if you have questions or comments. You can just email policy@energyinnovation.org.
Great, thank you. All right, so we have a few general questions that I think I'm going to ask about first, and then we'll go into the more specific sectoral questions as time permits. So collecting a few of the general questions. One of them asks about the non-technological approaches and how those fit into the mix. And the example is active and public transportation. I mean, I think you addressed those some, and I guess we'll talk about those in another webinar as well. But there's a few questions about more broadly sort of the non-technical solutions, and I guess that would also apply to some extent to nature-based solutions in land use area. All right, so that's one question. Another question is about overlap between sectors, especially considering indirect emissions, and sort of how does this complicate efforts to think about a sectoral approach to decarbonization? That would be a second question. And please, any of the three of you who feel you want to take these. Another one is about environmental engineering. That's not an overly specific question, but about also another one about offsets. How can get multinational corporations, the questioner asked, to adhere to something like carbon cap or carbon tax when they pay offsets to pollution, to their own pollution in other states, or we might add countries. And those are some. Oh, one other general question. When you encounter resistance, i.e. from, quote, traditionalists who would rather think nationally than sectorally, how do you turn the conversation around to reinforce messaging around the potential and very probable gains from designing policy instead by sector or issue? I like that question from Glenda Chen. Thank you. And we'll see if I guess that's one round. I mean, that's a lot of questions.
It is. I'm happy to start, and then Rachel and Patrick jump in. Actually, I'm going to take the last question first, because I think it's important when we think about some of the other questions as well. Most countries, when we think about how technology is regulated, it tends to be very specific to sectors and end uses within a sector. So what I mean by that is, if we look in the US, the EPA and the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, they regulate cars, and they regulate either efficiency or tailpipe emissions. We have the EPA, which also regulates emissions from power plant stacks. China has a Ministry of Environmental Ecology and some other industries related to the regulation of vehicles per se, and the EU has a very similar system. So in terms of like resistance from folks who like to think, more broadly than the sectors, I think the thing to remember is that the current paradigm for regulating equipment, for the most part globally, I'm sure there are counterexamples, but the predominant paradigm is for agencies, state agencies or federal agencies with a specific kind of purview of technologies to create standards and regulations for those, and then to be enabled by legislation or fiat or another method to basically go out and make policy related to those things. And so for us, at least, that's why it's helpful. If someone wants to say not take a sectoral approach, is my response would be, okay, what's the pathway? What's the regulatory pathway for that process? And there might be a good answer, if it's financial and you want to talk about different borrowing rates or interest rates or and so on. But I think that a lot of the global system is set up to regulate, equipment within a sector. And so I find that to be, you kind of want to meet people where they are, and rather than trying to set up an entire new system of governance. I don't know if the other folks on the panel have additional thoughts on that one.
Just really a quick note. I think that makes complete sense to the extent that I think at the international level, you often, or kind of even at a country level, right? If a country sets a particular carbon budget or kind of CO2 emissions target that they want to achieve at some point in time, they need to underpin these with any kind of policies. And as you say, these policies typically speak to the sectors, right? So I think a lot of governments, a lot of policymakers probably think already in that dimension, just in order to keep things manageable.
I was hoping to just address one of the more general questions that I heard, which also might impact the way we're thinking about some other things. There was a good question about overlap between sectors and how those indirect emissions impact other sectors and how that can create challenges for a sectoral approach. So what's interesting about the model that Energy Innovation uses is that it's heavily focused on the interactions between those sectors, which is very helpful. So, if we're thinking about an example, like if the electricity grid is made up of 100% coal versus 100% solar, these are obviously made up examples, how will that impact the emissions of a fully EV transportation fleet? So what's helpful about using a model that has these kinds of interactions within it is that we can look at how different sectors impact other sectors. And Robbie actually helped create this model years back, so I might turn it to him to answer a few, go into a little bit more detail on that. And then we can look at some of those other general questions.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Before that, I just want to add to your point on this kind of issue of, sometimes it's referred to as scope, like scope 1 or scope 2 kind of direct emissions, and scope 3, the broader emissions. And again, I think it comes back to where the points of focus are for policymakers and regulators, right? Like if I want to reduce indirect, and let's say we've got electric vehicles and we want to reduce indirect emissions. It's pretty hard to tell someone like, go charge your car from a solar plant, go charge your car from a wind turbine. You can't really do that as a consumer. But on the supply side, with electricity consumers and utilities, that's where you can say, okay, you the utility need to produce some share of your electricity from clean sources. And so I think, it can be really hard to deal with, to approach emissions and policy with it from an indirect perspective, because that's not traditionally where the decision points are. The decision points tend to be from the producers of things or kind of the buyers of technology. But especially when we're talking about energy consumption and fuels, it's pretty hard to give people options. You go to the pump, you get gasoline, and if it's mixed with 5 or 10 or 15% ethanol, that's not really something you have control over. Likewise with electricity. So I think the exception there might be that increasingly for these large corporations and multinational corporations, there's kind of a consumer and open disclosure push to have them disclose their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and then to put public pressure on them to decarbonize. But from a regulatory perspective, there's not a great mechanism in most places to kind of enforce that on the indirect emissions. So I just think, building on Rachel's point about kind of upstream, that's an important part. And then, the EPS is kind of designed around, EPS is the Energy Policy Simulator, this concept of fully capturing policy interactions. And so we have a whole bunch of documentation on that for folks who are curious and want to learn more about how we do it. But it is really important in not just to be able to capture those, but then also to be able to figure out, okay, if I'm going to move to electric vehicles, I need to make sure I have the policies in the electricity supply system to make sure I'm not, undermining the emissions reductions there. And so our tool, there's lots of other tools out there that can do that as well.
Great. Thanks. Any other comments on that round of questions or shall we proceed for just a couple more? Sure, let's proceed. It seems to me that one of the questions is also broad. We've got several questions about the technology sector, about building, heating and cooling. I think those will come up later. And again, we're going to have 5 more webinars addressing sectoral specifics. But just for now, there's an interesting question about climate reparations, which I believe is referring to sort of high mitigators and responsibility maybe to vulnerable countries. I guess that may be a question about loss and damage in part. Maybe, how does that relate to a sectoral versus national breakdown of responsibility? It seems that, that may be an area where national responsibility is perhaps more important, although I guess that's up in the air. And I guess a last question, if I may, is, it seems that the sort of direct decarbonization route sectors might have been those discussed by Rachel, whereas Robbie took sectors that have a bit more of a complicated panorama for decarbonization. I mean, do you have any views about that, since this is an overview about where the low-hanging fruit in decarbonization is and which sectors? I mean, it just seems that the energy sector seems like it may be by far an easier one for which we could conceive of technology shift and policy changes to lead to that technology shift, as opposed to, say, some of the other sectors which are much more complicated, the industrial sector, for example. Would you have any comments about that? And I address that to all 3 of the panelists. And thank you very much for joining us.
Happy to jump in on the second question. I don't know, Patrick, you might have thoughts on the first one. So definitely there are some key takeaways here. And the thing, Rachel mentioned it as well, but I think one of the things, if you take away anything from today's presentation, should be the issue of stock turnover. And that especially for buildings, which, building equipment can last 10 to 20 years. Some industry boilers and furnaces have been around for 40, 50, 60 years in the US. They have very long capital life cycles. Is that no matter how quickly we move, even if we had 100% of the technology solutions available tomorrow, and as all of the existing equipment kind of retired and needed to be replaced, it would take a very long time, 10, 20, 30 years or longer, to fully decarbonize those sectors without introducing some very expensive policies to motivate industrial consumers or building owners to more quickly kind of replace equipment before it's kind of at the end of its useful life. The power sector is a little bit of an exception to that rule, depending on the country. But at least in the US, we have a system of regulated utilities, but also what are called independent power producers who can enter the market. And if it's profitable for them to do so, it doesn't matter that there's plenty of other power plants. They'll enter and they'll push the inexpensive, dirty power plants out of the market. And so the electricity sector, even though it's characterized by these kind of very large, billion-dollar sometimes plants, it can move a lot faster because it's more subject to kind of market competition. And so in all of our modeling, the electricity sector is the fastest to decarbonize for that reason. And because as Rachel pointed out, we have a lot of available technology solutions, maybe not to get to 100% today everywhere, but to get to 70, 80% today. And then that sets up the decarbonization of the rest of the economy, or much of the rest of the economy, through electrification. So the key kind of takeaways are the electricity sector needs to move fastest, but at the same time, given that lag time to fully replace all the equipment in the other sectors, we have to start very soon on getting the low-hanging fruit in those sectors, whether it's, you know, electric vehicles for the right applications and local delivery trucks should be electrified, or low temperature process heating in industry to move to heat pumps instead of burning gas and coal. We have to be moving on those steadily over time in order to hit our mid-century targets, while we rely on the power sector to move fastest first and set us up to electrify the rest of the economy.
Great. Well, thank you. It's clear that with the modeling and information that you've presented us, we can all think of more concrete ways to move forward. I think that's really key. And would anybody else like to, of the panelists, like to make a last comment? Okay, if that's the case, I want to again thank Robbie Orvis and Rachel Goldstein of Energy Innovation, Patrick Bayer of the University of Strathclyde, and thank all of you for joining us, and encourage you to join us again on March 7th. We will be very fortunate to have further analysis from Energy Innovation of the first of the energy sector. And for that session, the discussant will be Dan Fiorino, who's the director of the Center for Environmental Policy at the School of Public Affairs, the group that I also represent. My name is Todd Eisenstadt, and I appreciate your joining us today. And have a great 2 weeks, and we'll see you March 7th.